Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right. Friday nights with Pat at the Stoa. So I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa. And this is a place where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today we have probably the baddest man on the internet, Pat Ryan. And he's going to give a talk on trauma drama, which I'm 10% nervous about. So what's going to happen is Pat's going to share his thoughts, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. If you have questions for Pat, just write in the chat box, and then I'll unmute you and you can ask it to Pat. That being said, I hand it over to you, my friend.
Hey, folks. Thanks for round two, and thanks for bringing me back. Always appreciate it. I'll do my previous format where I explain what I'm going to do, and then we'll just walk right through it. Peter and I had a great discussion, a continuing discussion, actually, about certain topics regarding how people are influenced and how they're made suggestible. Is that even true? Is hypnosis a thing? Are these conspiracy theories true about how you can make people a Manchurian candidate? Of course, those are the contemporary tropes we have when we talk about such concepts. But what if it wasn't so insidious? What if you didn't need that level of malicious intent to get those type of results? What if we were actually doing that all the time anyways, and we just didn't even know it? So we kind of landed on this concept called the trauma drama, where the stance that I'm going to take is that trauma is actually essential to the brain. This is a very complicated and very controversial thing to say because we all have varying spectrums of either trauma, abuse, or terrible things that have happened to us. And this is in no way designed to undermine or make light of any of that. This is designed to explore the neural evolution of how trauma even came to be, why we even have the capacity for it. And at the end, there might be, if I convey this correctly, I will display the last slide without any words, and we'll just see what happens. So without much more, I am ready to begin. Let me go share my screen. This one. Share. Give me a pointer. And then, okay. So trauma drama. Start as a little monkey and end up an alcoholic. That's just how it goes. So moving on to the next slide. Trauma, start with the words, right? I'm not going to defeat the idea that trauma is something that needs to be redefined, that it's too personal. So I'm going to start in the personal. And the way to start at the personal is a homocentric concept called a definition. So here we start with what it means. It means a wound, to hurt. Actually, its root comes from to rub or turn, as in like irritate, like to grab someone, like do this, right? That's an important understanding if we're going to cling to the idea that trauma is this personal experience. And we're highlighting it, right? So those two highlights. Because it implies that it's non-fatal. It's not wound to kill, it's wound to irritate. Hey, you drew that, don't you? I do not approve. Wait, does someone have edit privileges? Am I being trolled? Oh boy. So anyway, because it's non-fatal and it's personal, it is automatically implied to be homocentric and anthropogenic as a byproduct. So trauma is things that humans do to humans, and that's as far as the conversation tends to go. We don't look at it from other spectrums or domains because, again, it's incredibly personal and intoxicatingly so. So it's very hard to, remove yourself from that kind of experience. It's very compelling when it comes to that. So, boy, that yellow line, If anybody did that, could you please undo that? That'd be
Yeah, how do people do that?
I think they're kindly highlighting something.
Okay, I didn't know if they could do that. Please stop doing that.
If you could undo it, that'd be keen. I don't know if you can. It's just going to be this yellow circle that's in the recording the whole time. It's just going to be weird. If anybody's a pro at Zoom, that would be super. But I'll keep going until someone figures it out. All right. So what I decided to do is continue with the anthropogenic and the homocentric definition of trauma. We'll start with the history of psychology, which is where trauma therapy even. Thank you for removing that. Where the history of this research even comes from. And a lot of these are going to be a little bit academic, but I'm going to focus on what's important about these things, the little red lines that just happen to appear. Trauma research comes from trying to defeat the Victorian British menace of hysteria in women. That's where it actually starts. So the British Victorians were very keen of their industrial accomplishments and their imperial conquest of the lessers in their hopes that they could modernize them. Except these damn women just wouldn't stop crying all the time. And that's as far as they looked at it. And that was pretty premature to even come to that conclusion. But they did it anyway. Of course, they were wildly wrong in their prescription. But this is where the concept of studying trauma originates from, at least in the West, in the modern West, I should say. I should punctuate that. So it starts from trying to make very upset women less upset, not by dealing with their actual issues, of course, but more like poking and prodding them like subjects and all the inefficiencies that unfortunately led to. So let's see, click again, which then leads us to, I gotta move that 1 second. It led to premature categorization of the problem. So hysteria was too wide of an umbrella. It wasn't descriptive enough. It's too broad. So you had two different people, Genet and Fraud. Sorry, did I say fraud? I didn't mean to say fraud. That must have been a Freudian slip. No pun intended. But there was two different schools of thought. You had disassociation and you had double consciousness. Now, again, these imply two totally different things. They imply that there's another spirit within you, right? So disassociation means you have multiple spirits in you and you can only pick one at a time. So I'm either going to be me or I'm going to disassociate into some other spirit. Double consciousness means they operate in parallel and they're influencing each other. So these are two high-level categorizations of hysteria, and that's what they settled on. They're like blindfolding themselves and trying to shoot a target and incrementing themselves towards something more relevant. So I'm not trying to forgive. I'm not trying to create a basis in which we then explain away and forgive them for all the very poor conclusions that their research has led to. I'm just trying to let you know where their brain was anachronistically, so we can make sense of why we have so many misconceptions on the concept of trauma. This is, again, compounding the British Victorian fixation on trying to make women more compliant to the rapid changes of the industrial period. And it kind of led to a bit of a backfire. He was deciding this. He was basically stating that the hysteria in women was a byproduct of fantasies of sexual abuse. And, some of these women were sexually abused. No, just kidding. They actually weren't abused. It was a bit of a problem. There was no experimental discipline or rigor. There was no peer review. It was just one guy running around saying, hey, these things are happening. And people just bought into it because of a celebrity. And it's just a mess, the utter mess. This is not how you conduct these types of research into people. But we all know that. I'm not really teaching anything new here. I'm just giving you context. So let's see. This is right. So it was once again considered that perhaps it wasn't just women doing this. Were men actually doing this too? And the answer from most of the research was no, and that changed with World War I. So with the advent of fully industrialized mechanical warfare in mass, I think 20% of Europeans' male population died in the 4 years of World War I. The concept of rolling artillery was devastating people. Men would go into the front lines. They would be exposed to the horrors of industrial warfare, whether it was gas attacks, consistent rolling artillery barrages, sniper fire, living in permanent panic, trench foot, getting lice and mites sitting around in the dirt, infection, all the forces of just horrors were inflicted on everyone at the same time across multiple countries, for the French, for the British, for the Germans, for the Slavic bloc as well. Anybody who participated in that war, it was a full mobilized war, so they threw all of their males into it. So in addition to having these highly industrialized nations, their women going and having hysterical breakdowns as a byproduct of the reconfiguration of family life and the reconfiguration of industrial alignment. Now it was the men's turn because they could all experience it at the same time. So the women were experiencing this initially. Now it was the men's turn. They were dumped into it because of the war. So now they were starting to express en masse and in synchrony all of the trauma that women were also showing the same behaviors for. And this unfortunately had a very negative side effect on the research of trauma, because this is terrible stuff. Because women were associated with hysteria, when men were displaying the behaviors of hysteria, they were considered cowards because they were acting like women. And so it completely interfered with the ability to research trauma, which is, again, another one of those. First, they miscategorized. First, they were too broad, and then they took an entire subset and they miscategorized it, and so they just pissed it away, just blew it out the window. So they were given these two massive sample sizes, the early researchers, and they didn't know what to do with it. Whether it was malice or incompetence or a little bit of both, we can argue that all day. Now, men and women are now finally displaying this kind of thing, this trauma, this unknown at the time human behavior that we're going through. But was it universal? Was it all men and all women? What about different cultures? Do different cultures display trauma in different manners? Turns out the Irish were different about it. They didn't like showing pain traditionally. North Americans were very stoic about it. They were like, oh, I'm sick, I should go to the doctor, and then I should diagnose myself as objectively as possible and leave my emotions out of it so I can get the proper advice, the medical advice. And then some of the Europeans, the stereotype of the loud Italians, like, oh God, I'm so broken, right? So every culture is very different in how they express pain, which gives a clue about the trauma. How can you have this objective, how can you begin to apply an objective metric to something that culture is so heavily influencing? It's tough. It's a really tough question. Let's see. And then you get to non-European nations, Nigerians. Nigerians, for example, it's a sensation of heat or writhing maggots. It's not even like this personal loss. It's not like, oh, I went through this thing and therefore, no, it's like, this thing is happening to me, right? It's not coming from me, it's happening to me. That's a very different way of how trauma is interpreted or looked at. You get to the Middle East, and especially when you get to Turkey and Syria and Iraq, then it gets off the rails because their cultures are old enough to have points of reference about things that reach all the way back into antiquity. So as a result, to them, there is no difference between trauma as a mental pain and as a physical pain. To them, it's all physical. So when this particular research was done, the people who were demonstrating traumatic results like PTSD or any type of psychological compensation from an event of trauma, they were actually putting their bodies in a state as if they were physically ill. So they would sit there like balled up in a corner, or they'd walk really differently, or they would they had this way of conveying to their own peers that something was wrong with them, as opposed to, stiff upper lips type of thing. So each culture had a different strategy of expressing, defining, and ultimately experiencing trauma. Now that unfortunately goes against the narrative of trauma being this big personal thing. It's my personal journey. And it's very difficult to get the objectiveness of it when you look at it from this level. So far, and again, right here, this is another position that's basically stating that trauma from Western constructs and Western research is individual in the focus, but social and political realities can be a root of it. But if you're looking at it from individual sense, like something's wrong with me or something happened to me, then you're going to not look at the social context that may be causally involved. Whether it's the source of it or the root is another discussion entirely, but those elements do influence trauma type of expressing and evolving through a person. So this puts us in kind of a tough spot because trauma as scientific psychology is a European concept. And that European concept is kind of predominant, especially when it comes to things like psychiatry and drug prescription and medication. The idea that all brains are the same and we all have these equal brains and we all have equal cultures is actually interfering with the research of trauma. And that's uncomfortable and hard to have that conversation without it turning into a political blowout. But I'm citing what I can to mitigate that type of thing. So we've covered European men, European women, different European cultures, an African culture, Middle Eastern cultures, and it's a broad spectrum, right? There's a lot going on in the human condition, it turns out, and culture is playing a role in how trauma is perceived, experienced, and defined. So there's an instinct here because we won't give up this, God damn it, we will never give this up. We will die by it. We will wipe out the world to make sure that scientific psychology is true. And God damn it, we don't care what the cost will be because fuck. So when you're approached with this question, how do we find a baseline? How do we find a baseline? Where is this mythical person that is independent of culture? How can we identify this one being in which we can then nullify or at least identify and do differential analysis on regarding trauma? And the answer is absolutely fucking miserable. Use children before they hit culture. Now, children do acquire culture fairly rapidly, but not at all ages. There's a gap between like 0 and 2 and 3. And this goes into a dark place pretty fucking quick. So I'll get into this dark space and I promise I'll immediately bounce out of it. So you had child sexual abuse. That's a thing. That's also considered a post-traumatic stress disorder just based on the expression of behavior when the child goes through it. They are displaying the same maladaptive functioning as female rape survivors and male combat veterans. Again, going back to that British Victorian challenge space that they were trying to originally apply trauma to. So they had to go back to pre-Freud and Freud and say, okay, we're seeing the same behavior here. Maybe children also get it too, because that children as a control group pre-culture can act as that sort of way to do the differential analysis between other cultures. So then you get into the more detailed results of what children go through: poor impulse control, aggressive, difficulty with interpersonal relationships. You guys can read. So the research is done. It has been done for the past probably 70 years at this point. I would consider it a fairly dark chapter in this type of research. There's still plenty of children who were subjected to not only controlled examples of these experiments, but also uncontrolled. If you look at the way mass media works, which we will get there eventually during this talk. But they're displaying children do display PTSD when they are put under sustained abuse. Now, this implies that independent of culture, there is something about the human brain that has either ways to deal with stress or is reacting to stress or something unexplained, right? So let's get out of this dark place. I personally don't like being here. So let's go find other baselines instead. Let's take some presumptions before we get there. What if it isn't anthropogenic? What if we've been wrong about this whole time? All of our research has been about looking at how trauma affects people and how people apply trauma to people, and it's all people oriented. What if nature fucks us up? What if, like, I don't know, a lightning bolt hits my uncle? It's pretty traumatic, right? That didn't come from a person. It came from Thor or something like that, right? So what if it isn't homocentric? What if humans aren't the only things going through trauma? I think that's a valid question. What if non-human mammals also go through trauma, like dogs or elephants? That's a fair assumption. I think enough of us have pets or worked in farms to have seen that. So let's leave the children alone for a generation. Scientists, thanks. Let's go look at animals, right? maybe it's their turn to be poked and prodded. So there's a lot of examples. I'm going to be in and out of this one too because this gets dark as well. African elephants demonstrate PTSD when they see their herd get culled or killed in bulk. They have differences in how they interact with the herds they then integrate with. Their ability to follow age-related cues gets completely shattered. They demonstrate depression as far as one can, like putting their head against the wall, for example, repeatedly banging their head against the wall, they will do that. So it turns out that social mammals, not just humans, are also displaying signs of trauma. Again, the question keeps coming back. Is this fundamentally neurological? Is this part of the animal brain? Is this like this person's brain? Is it this culture's brain? Or is there something fundamental to how the brain has been organized in which trauma exists? And then there was another example, regarding animals involving a monkey, which was the saddest goddamn thing I've seen all week. And I decided not to put it in here, but I'll give you a baseline. It was a 10-year study on a lab chimp who was subjected to, I think, 10 years of bioweapons experimentation. So putting different viruses and diseases and seeing that, and it wasn't even trauma from, like, it wasn't like smacking someone. It was putting that chimp into a state where they're constantly in disease for 10 years straight. And even then trauma happened. So even if your immune system was compromised in some way from the jump, your brain will still start to develop these trauma responses. And again, it was like 20 pages of the saddest shit you'll ever read. So I'm just not going to put it in here. You don't have to take my word for it, but you can look it up. Okay, so social mammals are going through this too. Trauma is happening here. All right, so we got humans, we got men, women, children, different cultures, mammals. Okay, that's a lot, but it's not enough. The reason it's not enough is because, well, what if it's not only for mammals? We're trying to answer where trauma comes from, so now we have to look outside of mammals. What about animals who don't have complex socialization? Elephants have it, and dogs have it, cats have it, we have it. What about things like, I don't know, ants, where it's just like genetic caste system and the communication is just pheromones? What if this whole idea of trauma being local and trauma being personal, what if it turns out that it's actually universal and a byproduct of biology? That would be uncomfortable, but it would open up the avenue of where to look to answer these questions that I'm raising right now. So let's start using non-mammal social animals who don't resemble our neural trajectory at all. So things that don't have human capacity, or social mammals, or things that are freaking alien, like fish, right? So even Petco says, hey, fish get traumatized, get stressed out, and they demonstrate it, right? So I didn't know fish could get traumatized. That didn't even dawn on me. Like, I knew all the other stuff. It's a fish, right? But apparently fish get upset. They prescribe that the way to fix a fish when they're upset is to fix their environment, surprisingly, because they're in a tiny little cube of water, and their pH balance could be wrong, or nutrients could be wrong, or whatever. Anything could happen there. So Petco has a real pragmatic, they didn't intend for this to be part of this discussion, I'm sure, but it's a pragmatic approach to, it's an innocently pragmatic approach to how to deal with stress for something. And there's a lot more here if you decide to read into it, the idea of fixing the environment to fix the fish, as opposed to fixing the fish, which is what the individual responsibility of trauma dictates that we should do. So I found that to be rather interesting. Ants. You'd think ants don't go through trauma, and you'd be wrong. So the way that there's a particular group of ants in Africa, the Matabele, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. They have to go to war every day with termites around their colonies to get food. So they're invasive carnivores from the jump. It's just the way their geodestiny has set them out to be. And when they are wounded because of these constant fighting, they lose limbs. They're many-limbed creatures, and they lose them. And when they lose the limb, they spit out some chemical substance, and their all buddies say, "Oh my God, it's George. He's wounded. Let's go pick him up and carry him back." But it doesn't end there. There's some additional stuff about this trauma response that's also interesting. Once it's there, they then proceed to do medical prep on the ant. Now, you'd think these ants are breeding at a rate that's stupendous, like 10,000, 20,000 a day. Why even bother salvaging a single ant? Well, ants appear to make the calculation that that's a good idea. We shouldn't put the burden exclusively on the queen's ability to create more ants. We should salvage what we can. And that's only possible because of trauma signaling. So now we're starting to see, okay, perhaps there's a function to trauma as opposed to it being this individual experience that we're all told that it is. The licking will be done to, and this particular study was done in Switzerland and the Bavarian region of Germany. So the Swiss have a ant colony that has one feature that is unlike any other feature. It's an ant colony where multiple gene lines of ants live simultaneously. Usually they go to war and kill each other, but the one in the Alps, they work all together, and they have these huge hives, like big hives. And there's millions and millions of queens. There's millions of queens in that hive, let alone the tens and hundreds of millions of ants. And because there's so much life crawling through it, that these ant piles generate a stupendous amount of heat. And that in turn becomes a incubator for bacteria and viruses. So what these ants have done is they farm a resin from local trees, and then they spit their formic acid on the resin, and then they take the combination and then they clean each other with it, and it has antimicrobial properties. So they're actually administering antibiotics to each other, which is between us and the ants, it's the only animals that actually do that. To chemically synthesize an antibiotic, which is fascinating. But that's what's going on here. They're cleaning each other to make sure that there's no infection. And this is ants whose brains are so small I can't even recognize that, right? So biology and neurology is a hell of a thing, and trauma appears to be an important way to signal that whole process. But what if you're severely maimed? What if you're like really mangled here? What if the trauma is just unbelievably severe? Because the call has to be made. You can't rescue every ant. You don't have the resources for it, for starters. So you gotta have a filter here. If you are severely wounded, if the ant loses like 3-4 limbs, the ant's going to be in pain and it's flailing around, and it is sending the signal. But the problem is it's flailing around so much that its buddies can't help it. You can't put a flailing ant on your back; it's going to fall off all the time. And so you have to make the call and say, well, this ant isn't flailing as much. I could actually save this one, and this one's just doomed. Now, that's interesting as well, because it's not like they're making a moral decision. It's not like they're saying, well, I'm going to save as many as I can. It's not utilitarianism. It's all locally there. The gradient of the chemical that's being expressed from the trauma, the whole battlefield is just immersed in it after the conflict. So it has to make these gradient-based decisions. And then it has to assess really quickly, can I even pick that thing up? And it's not making, again, it's not a utilitarian moral choice in these type of things. So interestingly enough, one could extract that this exchange could be the birth of Stoicism to a degree. The idea that, oh, well, I'm wounded or I'm hurt or I'm being traumatized by this thing that I can't control. And if I flail around about it, I'm not going to get the help I want. But if I'm kind of nonchalant about it, let it happen and sit and process it, that might be a way to attract the help that I'm looking for. It's interesting. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is an interesting aside because ants are already doing it apparently. But yeah, when they flail around, it's basically a death sentence. So, okay, we got animals, we got mammals, we got critters that aren't mammals. We're getting somewhere. We're finally making some damn sense here. Trauma is starting to demonstrate functional purpose as opposed to being this miserable thing that happens to us and we're just doomed to live with it forever. There's actually some neurological purpose here. What if it's natural? Let's continue to make some assumptions here. What if trauma is natural? It's just, you're alive, there's trauma, that's the game. What if it's functional, as it's starting to demonstrate that it is? And what if it's required? That's the painful one. That's the real tough one. The idea that trauma is required. So let's look into how that could be. And we'll use evolutionary psychology. So where does this even come from? If we're going to make these presumptions, where is the driver for this cognitive state coming from? Predator and prey. Eating. That's where it's coming from. And you can confirm this over and over again with studies like this, where you can take predator urine, spray it around mice, and they'll lose their shit. They'll demonstrate PTSD just by smelling the piss. That's interesting. That shows that it's fundamental to the neurology, because this is not fundamental to the neurology as much as it is this relationship between predator and prey where trauma is originating from. And that's an interesting idea, because that implies that certain types of trauma can be categorized a bit more correctly as opposed to women hysteria and men who have shell shock and child sex survivors. What if you get down to that fundamental about how much of the predator-prey psychology are we still carrying with us, then we might be able to identify how our stress response and our trauma responses are formulating. Right. So likely effects on fecundity and survival are the norm in nature. Right. So the idea that it is beneficial for prey to go through trauma because it enhances their ability to survive against future predator attacks. So now we're getting to the actual function behind it. Something can only exist if there's a benefit, to a degree. You can have some maladaptive stuff as well. But the maladaptive is still functional at the same time. And so how can that be? Right? That's a wild statement. I'm going delving deep into controversy here if we're still clinging to the idea that trauma is this deeply personal experience. So just hang tight. I promise it'll make sense. So this is the predator odor, just smelling the odor, being aware of it, and kind of putting the prey in that type of state. And this is, again, mapped at the brain level too. There's MRIs on all these animals that's showing the brain is actually doing these things. Okay, so I'm gonna make a premature categorization here. Feel free to trash it and tell me I'm wrong all day long. I'm not gonna strongly defend this categorization. It's just to drive a concept home. And maybe you'll see some stuff and maybe you won't. So what we've been talking about, and from what I suspect, most of the trauma that we're describing that we go through individually is actually prey trauma, meaning we're describing trauma from the perspective of being predated upon. And that's only one half of the picture, because predators go through trauma too. It's just they go through it differently. So let's look at it. Prey trauma. These are the four things that we associate with PTSD, according to some variant of DSM that I don't even believe in. So there's hyperarousal, meaning when you go through the trauma, now all your senses are fired up. I'm now really looking around, right? I'm smelling things, I'm tasting things, I'm like alive more, right? So I'm like, whoa, I just got the shit kicked out of me. Oh, fuck, I'm amped up. Oh, I'm fucking crazy. I'm hyper aroused at this point. And what does that do? Why would that be a response to trauma? Well, it enhances your alertness. You just got chased by a predator. So you want to be aware that there are more predators behind me? Have I really outrun this thing? You want to take in and drink those details as much as you can so you can make the assessment that maybe I can start toning it down a bit. Maybe it's safe to just chill for a second. Right? So hyperarousal makes a ton of sense from the functional trauma standpoint in terms of the evolution of it. Unwanted recurrent memories of distress. So flashbacks, right? Back in Nam, man, that type of stuff. But there might be a function to that too, because if you're forced to replay the experience over and over again, then you will be forced to then extract additional patterns and more associations from it. Shit you might have missed when you were too busy running. So you're running, you're like, oh God, this wolf's behind me. I'm not really taking in all the things around me. I'm dodging that tree. I'm jumping over that water. I'm doing all these things. But maybe I missed something. Maybe I was running and I saw some ice and I was slipping around. Now the lesson is when I'm running from a predator, avoid ice, because that's bad, because it's going to fuck me up. So the only way to get that retrained into your brain is to have it forced into your experience over and over again. So now there's a function to what is a flashback. So let's keep going. Avoidance of associatives, where now you have the chance to practice what it is you're formulating in your mind. Or not, you're not formulating in your mind. You are demonstrating that you are physically demonstrating that you have learned some things from the trauma encounter. And what you're doing is you're avoiding the things you've associated. So going back to the ice example, you're running yourself on the ice. Now what you're going to do is avoid ice from here on out. And they, oh, that's predators and ice are a bad mix. I should avoid that. So now you're avoiding the things you're associating. And so what your body is naturally, it's naturally concluding, or I should say, by associating it to predators, you are either enhancing your survivability in the next encounter, or you're just batshit crazy and you made the wrong association. That happens too. It's not like there's an authority, a referee out here saying all your associatives are correct. You're just going to do the best you can with the limited meat space you have. But you will be avoiding those associatives as part of confirming that you have learned trauma-based learning. And then social detachment. This one's a little tough. I'm going to wing this one. I'm probably wrong. But I think because in the case of rabbits and anything, that's social by nature. And I realize the flaw of using social mammals here. I think because they are social and there's a lot of social stimuli going on all the time, that detaching from the social so that you can then spend more time with the trauma. And so you can extract all the associatives from it. I think that's an important part of making sure and enhancing your survival for the next encounter. So you minimize your inputs as much as you can and say, okay, let me really process this and get what I want. So from the prey standpoint, trauma is actually really important for survival. If all of this holds, now the details are details, and again, I'm spitballing here as much as I can, but I'm presuming that there is neurological functional purpose behind the things we do. And from the perspective of prey, it appears that trauma helps them survive. So let me catch my breath because that's, boy, that was physical. So predator trauma. Predators are doing the same thing. They have the same trauma responses here, but there's a key difference. For prey, the trauma is personal. They do have to learn these new tricks to get better skill sets against future predation. So it's very individual. But predators, their trauma is intrinsically social. Now, why is that? So you'll see cases of monkeys and baboons and apes and all that family, dogs, killer whales. They're all having a different context for the same trauma. So they're actually filtering for different lessons. So for example, there's a type of penguin. I forget which one it is. And monkeys do this too. But there's a type of penguin I'm going to focus on that steals from other penguins. So the penguins will get together and they'll make a nest. They'll take all the rocks and they'll make their nest out of the rocks. Now you can either go look for a rock and then add it to your nest, or you can steal the rock from other penguins. But when you steal the rock from other penguins, you want to make sure that the other penguins aren't around to see you do it. So there's deception and there's deflection going on, right? So I'm trying to hide the fact that I'm stealing from this thing so I don't violate any social resource sharing type of things that I'm stuck in. So that's trauma. That is effectively a form of trauma. Any psychologist will tell you if you're engaging in these type of behaviors, that's traumatic response. And animals are doing this. There are animals that steal from each other all the time. They'll steal from other species too, not just from their tribe. They don't want to get caught in the predator-prey trap. So they're minimizing their exposure to that. So they're clouding the analysis of the social situation to, maintain where they've been. Plotting also happens. This happens all the time in males. Oh my God. And the alpha is there and the betas don't like it and they plot and they form a pack and they kill the alpha. Monkeys do this all the time. Humans do this all the time. But that's social trauma, right? That is predator trauma. Leading. So again, chimps, I'm over-relying on chimps here. But sometimes people get exiled. Sometimes animals of the pack get exiled. they failed an attempt to take out the alpha, for example, so they get booted out. They'll come back pleading. They'll try for years in some cases to come back pleading. That's predator trauma. Prey doesn't really do that very much. They don't try to get back in the pack. Mostly, especially in the case for rabbit, their life cycles are so fast, they're either dead or they're not. But predators are robust in terms of social arrangements. They have to work as a unit. And all of these trauma points are ways to signal that something's wrong with the unit, something's wrong with the group. And so that's why, again, this is now functional. We're still in the realm of functional improvement, except that in this case, it's gone to the social cohesion as opposed to the individual betterment from the prey side. Naked aggression is very common, snapping at people. But what you're doing in that naked aggression is you're demonstrating your pack utility, saying, I am still fierce, I am still useful in the hunt. And subservience is a very common trauma where like, oh, this person's beating me, fucking stop, please. I'll respect the alpha. And self-criticism. Now, not all predators are the same. There's the run and chase predator, and then there's the ambush predator, like spiders or certain type of spiders. So they'll dig themselves in a hole and then they'll jump out, right? They need to associate themselves in their environment to see if their camouflage works. So if they fail on a hunt, if they fail to spook someone consistently, one, they're starving. They don't have food. They've expended a lot of energy to go get that food and it didn't work. So now they have to do like this proto self-criticism. Have I properly blended into my environment? Now, they're not doing this cognitively, not like the way I'm describing it. But there's the trace foundation of a self-criticism element is there. So this is, there's overlap here too. It's not so cleanly separated. There are trauma responses that both predator and prey do, like for excessive grooming, for example. Both of these critters will do that, whether it's a cat or whether it's a guinea pig. Excessive grooming is a common response when social trauma is available. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say that there is at least, if we're going to accept that that trauma has a functional source, and we're going to accept that the primary driver is the predator-prey relationship, then it's probably worth exploring how there might be differences to then make some proper diagnosis here. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples. Well, first, we'll just walk through and summarize all the stuff I've been saying. It drives unconscious learning. So it's not like a lesson. It's not like reciting with a teacher and saying, oh yeah, then, in 1773, some guy did a thing. It's more like trauma's there. It happens so fast in a predator-prey scenario that you don't have time to actually sit and absorb all of it. You have to get the hell out of the problem. So you're running really quick with your prey. And so the only way to drive lessons from that experience is unconsciously. The repetition of memories. Sorry, gotta go back to my notes. Avoiding associatives to then practice the things you're extracting. Social detachment to enhance your extraction abilities. Hyperarousal to even see if the predator is still there for the next count. So this is all unconscious things that your brain will do on your behalf without your permission. And it's embedding. It's not memorized. It's embedding into your nervous response. And that's an important part too. And then when it's embedded, it's not recalled like, oh, I remember what I did Tuesday. It's replayed. So if you go back a couple slides, you'll see that a lot of the trauma people, they don't actually memorize the trauma, but they replay it all the same. They go through what has happened to them. And that makes sense if this is functionally true. They're going through it to extract additional patterns so that they don't get traumatized again, right? So you don't recall it like you're reciting from a test, you're replaying it because you're still not comfortable with the idea that you've taken all the lessons you need to take from it. And prey does this. Then the replayed memory adjusts behavior. That's what social avoidance does, and the avoidance of the associative. So it's adjusting how you're interacting onward. And that in turn that behavior affects your fitness. Do you breed? Do you not breed? Do you get food? Do you not get food? Do you help your tribe? Do you not help your tribe? All that trickles through it. And of course, that fitness is the driver of the trauma to begin with, the trauma relationship between predator and prey. And then around the circle becomes a circle of strife, right? So here we are. There's this this fully complete circle where the trauma is then selecting for how to avoid the trauma, but then it's an arms race, which is why it's so difficult to dislodge. So let's give some examples of all this stuff. Again, spitballing. Please tell me where I'm wrong on this one. I'll be happy to do the research. Let's just give some examples here, right? So this critter shows up. It's hungry. It's mad. It wants a piece of that rabbit, but from the predator-prey relationship, the responses will be different. From the rabbit, this is an irrational monster. It's ruining its day. It has kids to take care of, and this damn thing wants to eat all of them. This is not what I signed up for. I'm running, right? The wolf, on the other hand, looks at that and says, that's trash competition. I'll beat your ass. You're nothing to me. So the trauma response is different between the two players. A rabbit would never come to a conclusion that I could beat you. That thing is going to eat its family. It has a history of eating its family. So the conclusion it draws will be fundamentally different between the two players. See another example. It's grass, right? How does prey look at grass versus how predator looks at grass? Well, prey obviously sees food. That's association in this case, and the prey sees the food's food. So they both sort of see food. One's indirect. So one is very like chew grass, put in mouth, make association. The other one is, oh, my food eats here. So there's a layer of indirection that the predator then has to make the association of. And it can do that through predator trauma because if it starves, then it made the incorrect association of where the food came from. So then what if you start doing the human thing where you start experimenting with this type of natural response and you start playing social engineer or psychopath and you start staggering the time and the distribution of the replaying of embedded memories? Can you modify fitness? And the answer is, of course you can. So there's rabbit A and rabbit B, wolf A, wolf B. So on one half, if we take this group of rabbits, show them some wolves and some grass at the same time, or their focus is separate, they're going to say, oh, there's monsters. I'm like, no, there's food. That's a disagreement here, right? So do they collectively make a choice? Do they individually make a choice? What do? They have options to pick from. There's no right or wrong answer. The context is very fluid at this moment. There's a wolf, there's some grass, what are you going to do? Meanwhile, the wolf pack is doing the same thing. Oh, there's hints of food here, but oh no, these wolves I don't recognize are competitors as well. Things get sticky. It's not so cut and dry. This is where natural selection does its thing. Who's right, who's wrong? You don't know until the body count starts accumulating. And then there's your fitness. You've modified your fitness because the decisions that those individuals made determines the fitness later on. This in those mixed signals environments. And then sometimes they'll switch perspectives. So this particular person, this particular entity used to be in the wolf pack, but maybe it screwed up. Maybe it made the wrong turn or it interfered somehow or it pissed off the alpha. Who knows what happened? But some severe trauma happened at some point where when the wolf looks at this grass, it starts taking on the properties of prey trauma instead. It'll start being hyper aroused. It'll start looking around. You'll see this in zoo animals. They'll start doing all the things. They'll start having prey trauma instead of predator trauma. Predator trauma is healthy for the predator because it's social adjustment and fine-tuning for the pack. But if the wolf gets isolated, it's going to start demonstrating prey trauma. So then let's look at semi-novel threats. There's a wolf with some glasses, this little mustache, cool hat, bandana, right? So this is semi-novel in the fact that it's all a wolf, but there's like slight modifications. Same thing, you can still modify the fitness here. Because even if you hide the fact that this is a wolf and you put these little cute things on it, the trauma, the associations are still being made. There's monsters here. No, they're fake monsters. That's not a real wolf. It has a hat on. How can that possibly be a real wolf? So now, again, these complex decisions have to be made, and they are made in the natural selection space. Wolf might see competitors. The other one's like, that's all fake competition. That's not real. That's not a real thing. But the natural selection still pans out based on the decisions that are made. Things might disappear. There goes that player too. But then the severe trauma of trying to make that decision might switch one player to then start having trauma of the other. This can happen. This has been known to happen. You'll see this with zoo animals. You see this in hyperaggression. Prey do demonstrate hyperaggression sometimes. They demonstrate predator trauma. rabbits are known to fight each other constantly, and not for mating reasons either. So the next slide, I'm just going to walk you through it. And I'm just going to show it. I'm not going to say a word. We're just going to see what happens. So good luck. You can affect the fitness of people over a long amount of time just by trauma training. One event, as long as it's common and semi-novel, you can make people switch their trauma response to full prey if you need to. It's totally possible. That's it. That's my wild conjecture. Feel free to criticize away. I'm probably wrong on a lot of the fundamentals, but I'm open for wild assaults against my character.
No wild assaults on people's character at the Dark Stoa, my friend. So if you have a question for Pat, just write it in the chat box, and I'll read it on your behalf if you want me to, or just unmute yourself. Lots of stuff came up there, but one thing came up was your mention of Stoicism and sort of its potential evolution. And the thought of virtue came to mind, being virtuous. And I was jamming with someone recently. We're talking about the kind of like and you and I were chatting about this too, like the kind of the axiomatic principle or foundation of Stoicism is living in accordance with nature, or I like our friend Jordan Hall. He says being right relationship with reality. And if you're in right relationship with reality, you're in right relationship with everything, including the fight or flight response. And what comes to mind is being virtuous is being in right relationship with the fight or flight response. So I just wanted to throw that out there to you, and if you have any thoughts on that or virtue itself. You're on mute.
Thank you. The argument I've been making is that trauma is so abundant and so abundantly present across species that calling it trauma is just as bad as calling it hysteria. I think because of that, the idea of virtue and being in right accordance, I don't want to nitpick on words because my brain wants to go there, and that's poor virtual signaling. But the idea of being right implies an information problem, that I don't have enough information to make the right decision. And so every individual has to make the decision that their local context is telling them, and the processes and the means in which that decision making and that sense making dance is evaluating. Trauma does have a role in that, according to the presentation that I'm trying to put out there, at least. That the idea that am I in a right relation with the moment? Have I correctly assessed that I am no longer being predated upon? Or have I correctly assessed that I am being predated upon validly? Those are things that our brains are constantly looking for in one manner or another. The virtue signaling sounds like social trauma to me, personally. And I'm using the word trauma because that's the word. I don't think trauma is the right word, personally. I don't think it's the right word. I'm just using it because that's the parlance. When someone is emitting virtue, what they're doing is it's emitting subservience to the alpha. You're saying I am in accordance to the pack's efficiency. And so please don't dislodge me from the resource access the pack gives me. And so that's the hard, brutal, like abysmal science approach. Now, if I step back and I talk about the ideals you're talking about from the perspective of the ideals, one thing that's not covered very well in the predator-prey relationship is the idea of self-sacrifice. That's not really abundantly well studied. In the case of like ants and termites, they have self-destructive, crazy chemicals that just ruin any invader. And so they got too close, and then boom, now you're covered in acid that's going to ruin your life, right? So that's kind of a self-sacrifice. But the idea of self-sacrifice is it's almost like I don't know whether it's a well-defined Stoic ideal or it's a virtue. But I do know that when you demonstrate it, it can induce traumatic response in all who are watching. Sometimes that traumatic response can be good, and sometimes it could be, whatever you're angling for. I can't give you a clear answer on this one, unfortunately. And it does sound like I'm trying to contrive this into the pitch that I just made. I recognize that. But to get to ideals, ideals are so far down the line from the intrinsic predator-prey formation of cognition. So I have to like walk through each and every one of them before I can get to that ideal space.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's possible, like you said, the subservient aspect of the predator-prey dynamic? Do you think it's possible to be subservient to a higher ideal, like the truth,
yes,
or Jesus, yes, or whatever?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because it's a little bit of perception theory, but because of the way, whether it's learning in the formal sense or that unconscious learning in which trauma is heavily leveraging. In either case, you have to make judgments from incomplete positions. And you have to be right. How do I know the predator's not chasing me? I just can't hey, Google, is the predator still on my ass? I can't do that, right? So I have to make decisions about my own life, which I only got one of because I'm a rabbit running. I only got one, and I got to make the decision that thing's not chasing me anymore. So I can now go poop and pee and stuff like that, right? So neurology appears to be selecting for means to make valid decisions from incomplete spaces. And sometimes the artifact of that incompletion can be represented very cleanly in a belief or an ideal. And once it fits there, then all of the traumatic responses will interact with that ideal and belief as if it was as valid as a reality construct. So I think, yes, you can have a predator-prey relationship. You can have a prey trauma and predator relationship trauma, a predator-trauma relationship with ideals that happen to correspond with making decisions from incomplete spaces.
So we're at the hour mark already. We're at the hour. Are you cool to stay about 15, 20 minutes to field a few questions? Yeah.
Sure.
So if anyone has to leave, feel free to leave. But there's a lot of good questions here. So let's do Daniel, if you can kind of unmute yourself and ask your questions to Pat. Yeah, I don't have the option. Okay, yeah, let me, now you have the option to unmute yourself, Daniel.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Yeah, I had a thought when you map things out in the predator and prey dynamic. In my mind, it could potentially map to also a master-slave or sadist-masochist dynamic. And so my mind went to this question, maybe you can riff on it. What does your definition of trauma say about sexual desire and power dynamics in adult relationships?
Yes, there is a lot of overlap there because of the predator-prey model. To answer this question, I have to make a presupposition that the trauma we are experiencing is indicative of the structural limitations of neurology itself. And what I mean by that is that the reason we have the trauma we have is because the way in which the brain has to operate as an efficient machine in terms of fuel and resource input, self-consistent management, and then output into behavior that then guarantees the brain can keep going. That's a very complicated dance. And so in that dance, that very complicated dance, you're going to come up with a wide variety of different behavioral outcomes and processes that can then drive those behavioral outcomes. In the event of the predator-prey stuff that I'm talking about, that's just one subset. Mating habits is totally driven by very similar types of limitations, and social habits as well. All of these drivers intrinsically have to deal with the physical space. It's not just abstractions. To most animals, the universe is not an abstraction. It's a real and only thing. It is a monad of all that could possibly exist. So you will have overlaps of violence in the social and the sexual space. And depending upon the neurological evolution of each creature, that's going to manifest sometimes in wild ass ways. Like, for example, when there's the praying mantis. It's like, oh, you're going to mate with me and I'm going to eat your head. To thinking humans, that's absurd. But the trauma is selecting for ways to minimize its exposure because it's having an effect on what is allowed to propagate, what did survive the predator. It's like this exception-driven duct tape ball that trying to express in any type of systemic way is just kind of pure madness. So it's just, I'm describing a fundamental mechanism of the selection. I couldn't tell you what all the selections are with the accumulation of it. I can tell you what a programming language is, but I couldn't tell you what every program is. It's like that. So regarding mating selection, social interaction, predator-prey relationships, I think they're borrowing from each other's toolkits a lot. There's going to be a lot of reuse and overlap here. I hope that answers your question.
As like a quick follow-up, I think the piece I'm curious about is it's also found in Stockholm syndrome, like in a dynamic where it seems like an organism is going back to the traumatic event, or they've repurposed it as sexual desire or something like that, which isn't necessarily not everyone agrees with that premise, but I just thought I'd throw it in there.
Yeah, it's feasible that during the replaying of the trauma, that the social and the sexual contexts are also being trained at the same time. It's not just purely the predator and prey. The brain has very limited space to freely experiment. Even with neuroplasticity, it's not as if the brain is turning you into a chair. I mean, it has to deal with very specific inputs and outputs. Your glucose and your oxygen consumption is very tightly monitored here. So it has to play with those within the bounds of that resource. So it makes sense to have some sharing. But like I said, there's no referee on what associatives are valid and which ones aren't. That's up for natural selection to figure out. And that's a uncomfortable thing for humans because we have this idea that we can always make things better. But life is hard sometimes, and not everyone wins. I mean, we're all going to die, so we don't win, right? So I mean, that's that. But I think you're going to see, because of the resource constraints and the fact that there isn't a referee of what associatives are valid, you're going to see sharing of these techniques.
Okay. Irene, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Pat your question? I'll unmute you. There you go.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Thank you. So yeah, I agree that PSD symptoms and a lot of reactions are a mechanism of self-protection to survive in that hostile or terrible environment. But what about little children that are pre-verbal, that have attachment trauma, where the parent is there? It's not sexual trauma, but the parent, it's emotional abuse. The parent is there, then they're absent. They may have depression themselves. What about intergenerational trauma? So these are inherited responses to traumas that you can't really consciously process, which is what's happening with First Nations right now. How does that fit into your model?
So because the predator trauma is intrinsically social, predators tend to have this, and I'm saying tend, I can't say all, but they tend to have this feature where they have to very carefully manicure their youth, their young. They can't just dump 10,000 babies and just kind of like, ah, well, y'all figure it out. The wolf has to very carefully take care of its child. We have to take care of it. Well, probably not in the case of wolf families, but we have to take care of our children. Elephants have to take care of the children. Monkeys have to take care of the children. So the predator trauma response of either failing to get prey or failing to negotiate the resource distribution of the tribe intrinsically leads to these family formations for pack efficiency. It's just the way the trauma response methodology in the ecosystem tended towards. So it does make sense that if there is a familial bond that is shattered in advance, a disassociation, and it is allowed to persist, that's where things get sticky. That's where things get real tough. Because in where you have a lot of these tribal creatures, if there is a social bond that is disrupted or a social trauma, a predator trauma has been activated, they will make it their prime priority to solve that shit right there. They won't sit there. And some of them might sit there and linger. You'll see that with the betas and the exiled. They do that lingering revenge fantasy type of thing. Wolves do this against the alpha a lot. But it can't be buried forever. It does express itself. So social traumas lead to intergenerational trauma, but intergenerational trauma is only feasible if the social trauma is allowed to happen, is allowed to persist, and you can't resolve it, which naturally predators do. They will resolve these traumas, and they won't let them stick and let them infest and linger. So I would say that the concept of intergenerational trauma is only possible when you have so much resource abundance that you don't care if someone's traumatized because there's just more opportunity tomorrow.
Did you have a follow-up question to that, Irene?
Few concerns in terms of learning, because I think there's different forms of trauma. So if it's like a freeze response, you're frozen out of your neocortex, or you're frozen out of your problem solving. So that's how I see it. So I'm not sure. I think you see it a little bit differently than I do. So I don't see it. I don't see that you learn that quickly from trauma.
No, it's not like you learn quickly. This isn't like the trauma file is on the hard drive and now it's permanently there in the search database. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that because of the limitations of the brain, its ability to have things grafted into it to a point that it's affecting your very complicated behavior, that takes time. That's why you need to do the social distancing, and that's why the replaying is happening. It's because of the limitations of having this really flow through your entire being so that the lesson is now part of your muscle memory. That takes time. And every type of social trauma that does manifest when a person is going through it and then signaling to others that the trauma is there, freezing, for example, that's intrinsically social too. It's the individual going through it, right? That's the mythology that all the trauma is individual and nothing else matters. But the individual is demonstrating the trauma is happening to the tribe, and the tribe has to then make the call: do we deal with this now, or do we just say, screw it, there's infinite resources, we don't care about you? And that's, so yes, I would agree that the idea of efficiencies in terms of speed efficiency, that's not what I'm promoting at all.
So let's maybe do one last question. Devinder, you had a question about depression. Where are you, Devinder? I'm going to unmute you. There you go. Devinder, you're unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hey man, what's up?
Yeah, so how does depressive disorder fit into the repeated trauma model? So what about depression that goes away, you learn from it and bounce back, versus depression that never goes away? Say you commit suicide or something like that.
Yeah, so again, because there's no referee of associatives, as a result, it's not as if you've made enough associatives and you can walk away. Like, oh, I made 20 associations about all the lessons I learned from my trauma. Now I can walk it off. Woohoo, I did it. Give me my medal. There's no authority out there to say that you found enough lessons and that you're comfortable enough to actually step back and engage. That's going to be up to a combination of social factors and biochemistry that is just a wild ass dance. You can engage in type of therapeutical responses to mitigate that to a degree. Whether that works or not is, again, that's it's more of a probabilistic hedge fund approach as opposed to a, take this pill and then you'll be fine. But if my guess is that if we look at the predator prey thing as some type of guidance, again, not the de facto standard, just as a method of guidance, if I am constantly trying to extract additional associations from the trauma, then I know, or I feel, or I believe that I'm not. I have not learned all of the things that have happened from this, and I am not in a space where I can even continue until I keep going. That sounds like a viable outcome, given how the brain is trying to organize itself. It may be compulsively trying to extract associatives. And that would be where I would look at in terms of like, neurological disorder, if I had to put a drug reference to something.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. So before I make any closing announcements, Pat, do you have any final thoughts to share on this?
Yeah, like I said, this is my ongoing campaign to strike at all things Western science, because I think it just needs to be done. They've had a good run. I'm still bitter about a lot of the things that they've decided and pushed under the rug. So this is just yet another expression of me taking a crack shot at that type of direction. So my bias is out there and in the open and obvious. And as a result of being biased, obviously I'm going to make some mistakes. I'm going to make some wild associations that shouldn't be made, so take that accordingly. But I'm always free for exception-driven stuff. I'm always free for any type of question or concern or criticism about this. Hopefully this, again, my goal here is to say, let's kind of back off from trauma as the personal, and let's look at it in context as a functional response from either why the individual goes through it and then what that means for social response to it. And I think if you look at that systemically, you'll start to reorganize approaches to trauma, perhaps ideally in a more effective manner.
Very cool. So we're going to stop there. I'll make some announcements in a moment. But Pat, thanks so much for coming on Dark Stoa, Friday Nights with Pat. Yeah, for upcoming events, go to thestoa.ca. The next one is going to be Staying Inside Solitude and Cultivating Interior Life with Greg Sadler. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And then Freestyling Through a Pandemic at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Tyson Wagner. And so basically we're going to do like this freestyle rap and with wisdom, obviously. And Daniel, you have a metagame mastermind. Do you want to unmute yourself and just talk about that briefly?
Sure, yeah. So we're prototyping how to create digital gangs to help people develop sovereignty and respond to the meta crisis. So tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, we're having another session on that.
Cool. Thank you, Daniel. And the Stoa is based off a gift economy. I'm viewing it as a gift to the world in this time of need. And if there's any demonic inspiration bubbling up to provide a gift to the Stoa, just visit that website and find out more information there. That being said, thanks everyone for coming out today. And Pat, you cool to stay on the line for? Cool.